Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I can see there are already quite a few of you in here, which is great to see. Today, we're going to be hearing from Victor Perez. I don't think he needs that much introduction, to be honest, about how to apply sensitometry in Nuke. So please make sure that you subscribe whilst you're here. And as always, add your questions in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So I think without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, if you don't already know, which is, you probably do. It's Victor Perez.
Hello, Anna.
Hi.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Cool. So thank you so much for joining us today, Victor.
My
So
pleasure.
excited to have you here. I guess for those of you who might not know you that well, can you just give us a short introduction for yourself before we move to the first demo?
Okay, so my name is Victor Perez, as you can read here below. I am a former compositor. Now I am a visual effects supervisor and a director. I have been in the industry for way too long, too much, actually. So I'm getting old, and I have a few tricks that I know about compositing that I think I can share with you today. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here.
Thank you. So I guess we can just roll straight into the first video and jump
Yeah.
right into it.
I prepared a few videos for you, so it's going to be easier for everybody just to follow. If you have comments, I'm actually watching the comment section, so just shoot your questions. So the first thing is that photography is part art and part science. The science part is called sensitometry. So how many times have they told you that compositing is photography, that you have to learn photography and yeah, go and take photographs so you are going to learn? But nobody actually is explaining why you should know photography and why you need to understand this science part in order to become a better compositor. So in my experience, I'm coming from photography, so I made the other way around. I started with the photography part, and then I focused on compositing. And I think that I was very lucky because unknowingly I was starting that path. Well, I'm here today to show you why sensitometry is so important that you should start caring right now. And we are going to discuss a bit of this. And you can apply, even after this session of today, you can apply the concepts, the basics of this. I'm going to make a few examples in Nuke. So the first thing is, what is sensitometry? Well, sensitometry is the scientific study of light sensitive materials, hence, the science of measuring the sensitivity of photographic materials. So it's just how a photographic material, something like a film negative, is going to react when the light is hitting the support. The same thing applies to digital support, sensors, and all of that. In here, I'm just going to use the usual film stock terminology because it's like the classic, and because everything is going to behave at the same way. Okay, so I'm not going to go much deeper into terminology or something like that. I just want you to grasp the concepts of what I am trying to do in here. So I'm using a lot of Kodak research and studies. This is from the Basic Photographic Sensitometry Workbook, which is a book that is for free, available online, made available by Kodak. And it says something that is really important, is the key in here, which is as a photographer, graphics arts, cameraman, cinematographer, or other user of photographic materials, you will use sensitometry in the control of operations involving exposing and processing photographic materials. Photographic manufacturers also use sensitometric methods in the control of manufacturing process. Okay? I'm going to add something that is not in the original quotes, but I think you should know, which is for these photographic materials, also a VFX artist is using all of that. So it's essential. When I first started working as a compositor, many years ago, maybe too many years ago, something that I believe is everybody knew about this photographic sensitometry and all of that, because of course everybody's working with photographic materials like footage. Everybody should know about that. So I was quite surprised to understand that not everybody was that lucky as I was, because I was a former photographer and cinematographer. So that's why I have been trying to synthesize all of that in order to deliver something that makes sense to understand. the first thing that you need it. Once you know that you need it, you can go and make your own research. But if you don't know what you don't know, how can you research about that? So this is going to be the subject of this. So just as an example, this is a sensitometric curves for the Kodak Vision 500T. This is a color negative film stock, okay? It's just to show you how a sensitometric curve looks like, okay? So it's representing the density on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is representing the amount of light. In here is represented with relative camera stops, okay? So you are going to see that light is not behaving in a linear fashion as it happens for the CG. So let's analyze a bit more about the sensitometric curves, okay? So the sensitometric curves describe a certain film's response to red, green, and blue light. They determine the change in density on the film for a given change of log exposure. Just to make this explanation a bit less cryptic, it's just the amount of light versus the value you are going to get. So if you apply certain light, so if you let a certain amount of light pass through the lenses and hit the sensor or the film negative, you are going to have a certain response and certain value. So the thing is like, I'm just going to make a very, very silly example. If you light a scene with one candle, you are going to have a certain amount of light. We are going to call that X, okay? Because it's something unknown. So that is one candle. In CG world, if you put two candles, you are going to have double the light. So you are going to have double the value of that you had before. Well, in the real world, in the sensitometric world, if you put twice that amount of light, maybe you're not going to have twice the value in the response. So that's why we need the sensitometric study, okay? So that sensitometric curve is just telling you that specific thing for every channel, red, green, and blue. And that is going to determine also the color of the film negative, how the color is going to be represented. That is not going to be the same for the low light areas or the midtones or the highlight, okay? So something that we are going to focus in this session is going to be the characteristic curve, okay? So it's not just the sensitometric curve. The sensitometric curve is going to pay a lot of attention about color and every stage of color at different amounts of light. In here, the characteristic curve is just one curve, so a graph representing a single curve to relate resulting value capture, so the density, this is coming from the film negative, so density, exposure, and contrast index to each other. So we are going to see how the film negative behaves, okay? The film negative or the sensor again. You are going to hear me many times saying film negative, but I mean the same thing. So on the vertical axis is the resulting value capture, so the density. And the horizontal axis is the log of exposure, the input or the amount of light, okay? The thing that is log, all of that, for the purpose of this session is irrelevant. You just need to understand that the horizontal axis is just the amount of light capture, and the vertical axis is the value that returns that certain amount.
I think we may have just lost the sound a little bit at the end there, but hopefully we can pick it up afterwards. So I guess it would be really good to ask you, Victor, what brought you to do this little series, this webinar?
You know, I have to admit that every time I'm creating a tutorial or a conference or something, it responds to a personal need as a supervisor mostly. So when I am supervising a project and I feel like I am giving comments of the same kind to the compositors, and I see like after a while I see a trend, like everybody new working with me is like, I have to go through that. I say, well, maybe I can just create a package so everybody can know that before starting coming to the review session. So at the end, I'm just very egoistic, just trying to help others to help me. So yeah, sensitometry for me is one of the pillars of photography, and not many people pay enough attention to that. So yeah.
Cool. Oh, that's really good to know. So I guess this is like a before you speak to Victor, watch this webinar.
Yeah, the manual, the instruction manual. Actually, it's not like that. Many people just have the intuition to understand these things that are in sensitometry. But I think is really helpful, even just to drop like a stone in the puddle, just to see the ripples. Because once you know that this thing exists, then you can research on that, and you can even implement methodologies. And for me, it's also once you understand sensitometry, you understand how, for instance, the Nuke grade node, which is something like very essential, why is done in that way, in that particular way, why the knobs are positioned even in that specific order. So it all responds to that. So we have to imitate the same reality that we are observing for support. So yeah, that is sensitometry. Everybody's doing sensitometry. I mean, applying sensitometry, but many people don't know that they are doing it.
Some people are just moving those sliders and trying to figure it out what on earth is going on.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes it works.
Cool. I was also wondering, just from an artist's perspective, what kind of questions should I start asking myself, when approaching a comp to help me think about the lighting, lighting my shot in the right way?
Well, the first thing is like, do you understand how the photography, the process of development works, or the process of creating an image, how light is going to behave in every single instance of the curve? So what happens in the low light areas, in the very black areas, in the mid areas, in the bright areas? So you for me, when I'm looking at an image, I see more or less a representation of the curve, depending on the brightness that I'm observing. So that helps me to synthesize many ideas. So always believe that an artist, any artist, creates before in the heads, and then in the case of a digital artist, then they translate their ideas into the software. But first of all, it needs to happen here. So for me, as a technical artist, because a compositor is a technical and artistic artist, you need to have like the technical side needs to be like breathing. It's like something you don't think about that, but it's in there and it's feeding and supporting the art part. So for me, the more you practice this and the more is internalized inside the way you see images, you are going just to naturally create something that is natural, because it's the way it is. So understanding something is just going to give you already something, even if you don't fully understand, but you start with that is already good enough, I will say.
Cool. Yeah, I think you just start to get a feel for it, don't you? And then you just kind of naturally start doing things. But I think a lot of people maybe work like that without thinking about this in the context of the science behind it.
Yeah, because we are so software oriented, and
Yeah.
it's very nice that I say this talking to Foundry, but but it is true. It is true. The software is very important, as the brush is very important for the painter. But the paint is not about the brush. The paint is about what you do with the brush. So once you know the technique of the brush, you forget about the brush. You just grab and do. So this is why it is important to learn Nuke, as it is important to learn sensitometry. But at the end of the day, all of that is just supporting one idea, which is make it look like it wasn't a visual effect. So yeah.
Get to that final pixel. Cool. Yeah. I think it's probably time to move on to the next round.
Yeah, because I'm going to in there I'm going to introduce what I said about the parts of the curve. It's going to be interesting. So let's have a look at the characteristic curve in action, and let's start by seeing the characteristic curve of the CG. So in the horizontal, you have the exposure scale. I say virtual because we are in the CG world, so there is no actual light. It's just a representation of light. And then in the vertical axis, we have the value scale, okay? So I'm not putting any numbers in the axis because they are irrelevant. I'm just going to say that it's just a certain amount of light and you get a certain scale. So both the axes are going to have their own scale. Okay, in here, as I said, it's irrelevant. I don't mind the numbers. I just mind the concept in here. So let's have a look at the light versus value. So when you apply a certain amount of light, you get a certain amount of value. And look, it's just going up to the infinite level. Yeah, because it's virtual. So it's just a numeric representation. And yes, in theory, you can represent infinite amount of light. Of course, you cannot visualize an infinite amount of value, but in theory, you can capture anything that is in there. And something to keep in mind in this particular example of the CG light is that there is a linear arithmetic progression. So remember the example of the candle. If you put one candle, you are going to have a certain amount of light. Two candles, you're going to have exactly double that. Okay, so light is just going to behave in that linear fashion. So the exposure to density ratio is constant for the whole curve, which means if you grab any segment in here, so for instance in there, the beginning and the end is going to have the same incremental in this low area that in there. So the slope and the progression is exactly the same for the same size of the segment. So it's a linear arithmetic progression. This is a straight line. I just want you to keep this in mind because this name is going to return later, okay? Notice something really important here, which is the minimum value. The minimum value in the CG world is actually the pure black, so 000 in RGB. And that is something that is just available in the CG world because for real cameras or film stocks, this is going to be very, very different. So this thing that the black is just representing pure black is something typical for the CG. So just to put an example to see this thing is like if you render a scene with no light, I know it makes no sense, but just to get the concept. If you render that scene without light, what you can expect is to have a frame that is pure black, so valued 0. It's just a black screen, okay? In the other hand, if you take a photograph and you forgot to remove the cap of the lenses, so there is no light that is going to enter in through the lenses and hit the sensor, so there is no light in there, it's never going to be the black 000. It's never going to be perfectly 0 black. Why? Because there is something involved in the sensitometric curve of every camera that is going to prevent the black naturally to be at 000. So it's not going to be pitch black. And no worries, this is completely normal for every camera in the world, and every camera is going to have a different minimum value, okay? That is one of the important parts that I'm completely sure you already know from the compositing basics, because of course, one of the things that you have to do is to match the blacks of the CG to the blacks of the plate, the footage, okay? So that is completely normal, but it's not just that. So that is just one of the steps. What I want to see with you is all the steps that are going to be involved when you are actually matching the characteristic curve.
All right, cool.
Yeah, that's a lot of words in there.
That is a lot of technical stuff all in one go. So on that note, please keep adding your questions to the chat and we can get them answered live for you. We did have a question about starter cameras. I don't know if you had anything else to expand on that one, Victor?
Well, I will say that to learn photography, what you need to be is aware of what you are doing. So just don't get automatic cameras. You can, of course, you can make beautiful pictures with your phone, but that is not photography as I mean. What I mean for photography is manual photography. Is you need to understand like the triangle of exposition, like aperture, speed, and all the questions regarding photography, because that is going to start triggering in your mind what happens when you open the aperture, what the diaphragm, what happens with the stops, what is a stop, why do you need to understand the stops to compensate. So these kind of things is going to force you to learn the actual science of photography. And then if you analyze what you are doing from the technical point of view, and you understand that what happens when you open the aperture, and what happens to the depth of field, for instance, what happens to the defocus. So how many things are going to be in focus? Where is the focal plane? So there are many technical things that when you get used to really photograph something, you are going to start the next time you approach compositing, you're going to start those in mind, because you want that compositing to behave exactly like what you see on the camera. So that is why I don't want to recommend any brand or any. I will say like any camera is a good camera if it's full manual. Just don't automatic cameras, because that is not going to help you. It's going to be beautiful pictures, but not the pictures that we want.
Not the best way of learning unless you kind of try and start to do it yourself.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so looking at that previous video that we just watched, how much of that are you kind of typically analyzing when you approach a shot? Are you actually getting that graph up and having a look at the graph for that shot, or is it now just kind of more ingrained in you and you just sort of do it?
I have to say that it is really critical to see an image that is a CG render that is linear, and understand all the parts of the curve. So it's just like hearing a symphony and just naming the notes is the same thing. So it's different, but you can have the feeling like when the symphony is like there is an instrument that is broken in there, so you can understand how to tweak things in order to make it look more adequate. Because at the end, compositing is a science that is going to be matching, usually is going to be matching an element of CG with an element of live action. So you just need to identify what elements of that picture in the live action are being represented in the CG in terms of light. So once you start analyzing those areas, is what happens with the shadows. The first thing that I always look into an image is just what happens with the shadows. I want to see the details in the shadows. What happens with those details? Most of the times you don't have enough detail, but if you don't know that you should have detail or not, it's just like you don't know what you are observing. So this is the important point of understanding photography. Is like if you are missing something, you are going to notice. If you have no experience at all, how do you know that you are missing something? So that is the point of the course. So I will say that I'm quite used to analyze that. And the most common error that I see in compositors is, for instance, the contrast ratio, because they don't understand exactly why the picture is looking wrong. And that, for me as an artist, that pushed me to get to become better. Because when I see something and it's not working, it's okay, as far as I know why it's not working. But the worst feeling that you can have as an artist is something is not working and you don't know why.
Yeah.
And that is already something, because at least you know that it's not working, and that is something. The worst is when something is not working and you are super proud because it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And everybody is like, no, man, that is not amazing. So, okay. But I confess that the worst feeling as an artist is just that. It's like something is not working. You know that it's not working. You don't know how to fix it, and you are rushed to present that to your supervisor.
Yeah.
That is what I wanted to avoid. So for me, when I'm supervising something, I like to grow my team, to make them grow, to show them, because at the end, if I help them grow, they grow me back. So at the end, we are all on the same boat. So if I make them understand this, of course, for the rest of their lives, hopefully, they are going to start applying that. So making the industry better is just going to be better for everybody. So that's why I admire people like Hugo Guerra, that is here, by the way. Hi, Hugo. So it's like, you are helping others to help us at the end of the day. So Yeah, it's a community.
Just making the whole thing more efficient.
Yeah.
The circle of the VFX world. Yeah, there's a lot of love in the chat actually, and from Hugo as well, who's helping us answer some of the questions. So thank you, Hugo. Thanks everybody. And yeah, please do keep adding your questions in there. I think we could probably roll to the next video.
Yeah. Now I show you the characteristic curve of the CG render, which is the linear light, which means the exposure increment is the same as the value increment. So for every amount of light, you are going to have the same amount of value in increments, okay? So the ratio is 1 to 1. And this is the natural way that CG is going to render light. And that is the perfect, it's just mathematically perfect way of representing light. We would love photographic materials to behave like that, but they don't. And actually, if you linearize any photographic material to have the same increments, actually it's going to look weird to us because we are very used to this natural feeling of contrast and evolution of light through the different stages of brightness. So we have to match this linear light curve into the characteristic curve of the footage we are using. So we need to understand the footprint of that footage. So now we are going to move into the film characteristic curve. Please be aware that I over-exaggerated the shape of the curve just for didactic purposes, so you can understand better every characteristic of this curve, okay? So the curve is going to represent the exposure scale and the density scale. So it's the amount of light being captured and the density or the value in our case, because we're working in digital compositing, that amount of light is returning, okay? So this is the shape of the characteristic curve, mostly of every film stock, okay? Again, it's over-exaggerated, but at least you are going to see, first of all, that it's not linear at all. So this is what I meant. So another thing is like we are calling densities because of the film negative, okay? But we are going to refer to the density scale as value for us, okay? Just to make things easier. But when I say density, I just mean the value that is recorded, okay? For us, it's just the value. Remember when I told you before that in the linear light representation of the render in the CGI, the first thing is that the curve was starting at value 0. Well, in here, we have this particular point that is the minimum density. So it's how black is the black. So when no light is captured, what is that appearance of the black? So that is the minimum density. This is something that everybody is familiar because when you are matching your CG, the first thing that they always tell you is like the black levels needs to be matched from the plate, okay? But it's not just that. If you know the terminology of that in sensitometric terms, you are going to have a lot of help when you are doing your own research or when you are using the tools, because that distance that you have from the 0 value, so the base of the graphics, to the minimum density, that distance is called lift. Do you remember that in the grade, you have a control that is called lift? So that control is meant for this purpose, okay? So let's start now in the horizontal axis. So we are going to see part by part every structure of this characteristic curve. Something that you are going to notice in here is that that portion of the curve is completely flat. Flat means that there is no contrast increment in there. It means that whatever is in that area is going to be completely flat. So no detail at all. It's just that area of the black that you have no detail. So nothing is going to be interfering there. There is no detail. And that particular part is called base and fog. The base and fog is representing that, the base level of the curve, and the fog is because the details are going to be lost in that black fog. So this is a portion of the curve that is just going to remove any kind of detail, okay? Remember, compositing is destroying the image with style. So this part of the curve is representing that area where we need to destroy the detail of the blacks. Be careful. It's not just destroy the levels because you want to. You need to destroy the same level of detail. So that's why you need to observe. First of all, if you don't know how to observe, you cannot reproduce what you are observing. So now you know that there is a base and fog. If we continue, you're going to see this portion in here that is where the curve is going to start reacting to light, okay? So this is the toe. So the toe is the curve that is transferring from the base and fog into the next part, that is that line that is quite straight, okay? So is where the details are going to start to rise. Usually cinematographers don't want to expose something in there because every area that is going to be in light in there, you have no detail. So it's something that is a characteristic, but you don't want to get the main actor to have details in there. So the next part is like the most important part, and it's the part that probably you have been focusing when you are working in compositing, which is the straight line. This is the line that the contrast is rising in a very linear light like, okay? So it's not exactly straight, but it's more or less straight. So it's the area that the cinematographer is going to use to have the faces lit. Okay, is that portion of the film negative, the stock, or the sensor that is just representing very well lit conditions. So that is like the star of the sensor or the stock. Okay. In here, there is something to mention that is important, which is that contrast that we have been talking about. Well, this part is very important, the slope. The slope is going to define the contrast ratio of the support, and is defined by the gamma. The gamma, that you have the formula here on the top, is just going to tell you the slope and how the contrast is going to be transferring from one point to another point. So in here, point A and point B are just two given points from the curve, and that is just going to give you a certain slope and a certain level of gamma, okay? Those are things to keep in mind when you are doing the color match, okay? And now we are going to move to the last two parts of the curve. In here, this part that you start seeing a decrease of contrast. So we are in the very high areas of light in here. And this part is called the shoulder. So the shoulder is just that part where light is just going to start losing detail when it's going too bright. You don't need to worry much about that because even humans are not that sensitive to the super bright areas. But you need to know that light is behaving in this way. So it's not just rising linearly as in the case of the CG. It's just having this decay, okay? The maximum density. The maximum density is just the maximum white you can capture. Even if it's not in a linear fashion, you are going to see that there is a portion that over that amount of light, you are not going to capture anymore. And that is going to define the next bit, that is the clip, the last area. The clip is the area that nobody wants to use because it's the area that you have no detail. Of course, you don't want to use it, but maybe you need to reproduce how it behaves in certain conditions. A condition that is going to be particular is not always shown, and of course camera manufacturers are going to try not to have that, is this solarization. The solarization is the inverse curve. So is that when light is too bright, yes, it gets darker. It just goes the other way around. That is called solarization. I'm just going to show you an example of the solarization in this photograph that is very famous. It's the Black Sun, Owens Valley, California, by Ansel Adams. This picture is from 1939. And as you can see, the sun in here is black. Well, that is the solarization, okay? So the solarization is when light is too bright, that gets dark, okay? That is a characteristic of the curve, okay? So things that are going to define the sensor or the film stock is, for instance, this point. This is the practical underexposure line. Practical because it's like below that line, everything that you have is just black, okay? Let's disregard that, okay? But in terms of the density, that is the minimum image density, okay? So as I said, you have two logics in here. One is relative to the density, the other is relative to the exposure. If you control both, you are going to understand much better what you need to adjust, because when we are doing compositing, we are actually playing with both. And then you have the practical overexposure line. Okay, practical again, because after that, we are just going to disregard the values. We don't care. We are just going to consider that blown, clip, or white, or something, as you want to call it, is just useless. Okay, that part of the curve that is useless for a cinematographer. Still, you need to match that. That is what I mean. Photographers or cinematographers are going to focus on that part, but you need to fix the whole thing, because everybody's going to focus on that, but the good artists are going to focus on the whole line. So with the practical overexposure line, you have also the intersection with the maximum image density. Just to put this into context, the minimum density and the minimum image density are different. Okay, the minimum density refers to the bare minimum that curve is going to reach. The same with the maximum, but the minimum image is just representing something that is more related to the practical terms, so what you are going to see or not. And then in here, we have the latitude. So that is like the exposure range. So the light that you can capture with this support. And that, at the same time, in the other axis, is going to define the dynamic range that we are going to refer as a contrast ratio. So you know how much light you can capture and how bright and dark that light is going to result in your image. So this is everything you need to understand when you are working with the sensitometric curve in order to conceptually match one or the other. But before to finish this section, I just want to contextualize both. So this is the linear light CGI, and this is the characteristic curve of that film stock. So what we need to do is to convert that linear curve into the CGI sensitometric match. So we need to model the curve in order to get the desired film stock look. And that is going to work only for that particular stock or sensor and not for anything else, because it's going to define also the exposure that was done for that particular take.
All right. Some really cool information in there. And just to let everyone know that this will be available after the recording. So if you want to go and watch anything again, then you can. And also please remember to like and subscribe. If you like this content, then please do that, and then we'll know to do more of it. Cool. So I was wondering, you've got all of these graphs going on and things, but do you use the histogram and waveform panels in Nuke whilst you're working?
Well, I'm doing it when I have to. This is a very good question, actually, because the scopes are used in my case when I have to analyze the image in absolute terms. So, for instance, if I need to color grade something like the whole image, then I'm going to use that, because that is the instrument that is going to help me to align, for instance, the skin tones, or to distribute the contrast or something like that. But when I'm using the matching the CG to the background, I'm not using any of those. I'm just using the color picker. Just the color picker to understand. That is the tool that I use the most. Sometimes I use the tools just to understand if there is something strange, for instance, in the parade or something, when you see like the brightness levels are like that, and then you arrive to the CG and it's like beep, and you have like a tiny gap in there. So it's like it's helping. Color is a bit difficult to understand because our eyes just trick you all the time. So the more you look at something, the more your brain is trying very hard to make it look right. So if you look at something for long enough, you are going to do the color correction in your head. And I'm not kidding about this. That happens. It happens to me many years ago. That I think it was maybe the first of my second day working at Cinesite. I remember I was working very hard on a shot for grading one of the CG. I remember I was so satisfied because it took me so long. And I was so satisfied when I went home, and I was like, oh, wow, I made it. And it was very difficult. The day after I arrived and I opened the shot, and I was like, this is looking really bad. What happened? And for a moment, I was like, someone has opened my script and has changed something because this is a conspiracy, it's impossible. It was so amazing. And then I understood how important it is to refresh your view. So if you guys are starting into the art and science of compositing, the first thing is like, don't do long sessions. Just have 15 minutes, 5 minutes break, and another 15 minutes, and then another 5 breaks. And you can say, oh my God, so I'm going to waste 20 minutes every hour. No, actually, you are going to earn a lot of time, because if you work all the way, you are just going to bin everything that you are doing. So it's going to be useless. So if you're not used to understand when your eyes are tricking you, you should be aware of that. So that is something to keep in mind. It's like the optical illusions, color is very different. The perception of color and the perception of luminance. Sometimes I'm working color in black and white. Okay, this statement is really bold. It's not like I'm working color black and white. It's like when I'm matching, I prefer to match one curve, which is the curve of luminosity. So I just put my viewer into luminance.
Yeah.
And I work with the luminance. Once I have the luminance right, then I work with the color. And I work with the color in one of the sliders, or the two sliders that maintain, the luminance. That is going to be the temperature, magenta, and intensity. So I'm going to keep the intensity and work with the temperature and magenta, because the eye, blah, 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 blah. So this is what I mean. Is like, once you know what you need, you understand why you have all those sliders just to manage one color. So this is the thing. Is like being aware, understanding.
And sometimes I find, I don't know whether this is really bad to say, but sometimes I find if I've matched everything technically and I've checked out all my luminance levels, I've checked the blacks, I've checked the highlights, and then I go back to the RGB image, because I've been in the, separate channels, looking at it in black and white, and then it's still, and I've done everything properly, and then it still doesn't look right. And actually, sometimes, even if it's not technically correct, it actually looks better if you just kind of, you've done all the technical stuff and then you like just tweak it at the end, like eyeball it. I don't know whether that's really bad.
Well, actually, it's good, because at the end of the day, the eye is the final check. The monitor is the final tool. That is the most important. So if what you see makes sense, that is better than having the numbers right, because maybe it's the error picking the numbers. So this is another thing to keep in mind. Is like, you need to understand that there is a certain level of error that you need to overcome by your eye, and that comes with experience. It's like sometimes we get so obsessed in the little that then when you go to the big picture, nothing is working. So you need to understand how to average. Sometimes another thing that I do, so today I'm just confessing all my skeletons in the wardrobe. So, which is, sometimes I work the color with the image blur. So I apply a blur over everything, so I don't get distracted by details. So it's like, many people say, that was a supervisor of mine many years ago that told me, something that you can do is just like almost close your eyes so you can see. And it's like, man, this is a blur.
I was just
about to
do that.
So
I sometimes whack a blur on there, or sometimes just kind of squint, maybe take my glasses off, have a look, maybe like move away from the screen.
Exactly. So you have to try. Another thing that helps a lot is like flip the image.
Yeah.
If you are getting used to an image, as I said, the brain is just going to do the black magic thing.
Yeah.
So just flip it. Work with the image in the other sense. Or if you want like really hardcore, upside down. That is just going to break your brain, because you're not used to that. Things look very, very weird. And there are many experiments on this, on how the perception of upside down changes. So at the end, you just need to focus on color area. So if you are distracted by the shape, by the form, by the no, because your brain wants to use the shapes, because we are much better on understanding shapes than understanding color variation. So we need just to distract everything. So yeah, blurs, using a transform to move the CG to another place. Just try to break the logic. And the more you break it and it works, it means that when it's logic, it's going to work even much better.
Cool. Those are some really good advice, actually, hopefully useful for all of our people watching. We did have a question about displays. And I think that was a really interesting one, because obviously if your display is, say, like slightly over to the magenta side, then obviously everything's going to look super green to somebody else looking at it, you know, on a different screen. So I think the question was about, you know, what would you recommend? Kind of, is a P3 display necessary, or is sRGB 709 enough?
Okay, that is about color spaces. And I will say, yeah, color spaces is something, but the precision of the monitor has nothing to do with the color space. You can have a very good sRGB monitor or a good Rec 709 monitor that are like the most common, but maybe the monitor is not accurate. Something that you have to search, and by the way, I'm going to have a talk at FMX about this topic, which is monitors. I will say, yes, to close, what is the most important thing to look into a monitor is the delta error. The delta error, if you want, what is the delta error? It's the ability of the monitor to represent colors that the eye is going to see like right. So the error means like the variation that you can get. So imagine like 100% of error is going to be like the red is going to look green. So it makes like nothing to do. Well, if you have a delta error of less than 1, that monitor is really expensive. So that is a good monitor. Monitors, I will say, like for visual effects artists, for compositors, delta error of 2 or less is good enough. It's really, really good, actually. A delta error of 1 or less is really, really awesome. Don't look for delta errors of 0 because it doesn't exist. So it's like paramount. So you just need to have the delta error to be really low, because that is what is going to give you the precision, regardless of the color space. Then, depending on what you are working, you are going to get the right monitor for that. So if you are working on HDR, you will need the color spaces for HDR, and the same for SDR, even if you are working for content online or whatever. So the monitor is a very complex piece of hardware, and is most important. And it's like sensitometry. We have been using a lot, but we don't know. And sometimes if you want the best monitor, you just go for the most expensive one. That is useless. So you just know what you need and get exactly what you need. So yeah, even monitors, by the way, have a lifetime. So after 10 years, change that monitor, because regardless of how good it was, after 10 years is a waste.
Cool. Thank you, Victor. Okay, so I think we should go back to sensitometry hardcore again and go to the next video.
How do we put into practice what we have discussed earlier? Well, let me show you a representation of this gradient, okay? This is going to be the linear progression from 0 to 1, okay? This graphic is representing the operations that are being applied in here, okay? Right now, everything is deactivated and is representing this color match for this scene that right now is deactivated. What we have to do is to convert this linear progression into the characteristic curve of the stock of this scene. So is there a way of reading that sensitometric curve? Well, even if you have it, it's not going to be of much help. The only way of applying the correction is just to understand the characteristics of light, but also to understand what are the operators that we have to model that line. So in here, I just have like the basic kit, which is the grade, the toe, and the soft clip with a color correct just for certain accents of portions of the curve, because with the color correct, remember that you can go to the ranges and isolate certain areas, depending if it's shadows, midtones, or highlights, and you can modify that target area, okay? So you can match the grade of a CG just by using a grade, a toe, a soft clip, and if you need it, as many color corrects as you need. That is the only node that you can replicate, because of course it makes sense that if you want to target different areas of the curve, you can isolate different areas with each color correct. For other uses, the grade, the toe, and the soft clip they should be only one. And if you have to fix something, you go to that particular question and solve it in there. The question is in the grade, or is in the toe, or is in the soft clip. So you need to understand the toe is in that area. The soft clip is going to be how the highlights are going to react before arriving to the clip. And then, of course, the color correct for, as I said, areas in the middle. I'm just going to switch on this to see the corrections that are being applied to that particular CG, okay? Let me show you that. This is the actual appearance of the toe and the base and fog. As I said, I over-exaggerated the graphic so you can see, but as you can see here, there is a flat area and then there is a recovery. Even if it's very little, it's really important. Something to keep in mind is human beings are way, way more sensitive to the dark areas than to the bright areas. It's very simple, it's evolutive. We have been living in caves for many years, way more than we have light. That is something like less than 200 years ago. So we are very used to see in the dark areas more than in the bright areas. So a little difference in here is not going to be that noticeable as a very, very little tiny variation in the dark areas, okay? So this is just for you to know. So this is the curve, and I'm going to show you the resulting of this, okay? This is just a quick sample, so I'm not meaning to have this at a production level, okay? But it's just to show you how the original had nothing to do with the footage. And with that, we are getting the right amount of, for instance, the toe and base and fog of this particular footage that, as you can see, there is no difference between the arm and the back. So the base and fog in here is really long. So there is a lot of areas that you are losing the information, okay? Same with the other areas, the transference. This is the toe. This is showing me that the toe has a certain tendency to recover earlier in the magenta area. So the green channel is going to be affected differently from the others, okay? Because if they were all together, the transference will be like, monochrome. No difference in the contrast ratio in certain colors. In here, we have to recreate that, okay? There is a little bit of that, as you can see in there. Maybe you can do more, but that is something that you do when you are working. So for me, what is important right now is to show you how these things work. So I'm not going to show you how to match the grade because that will be the subject of many sessions of this YouTube Live, but I just want to show you that the manipulators that you have, for instance, in a grade are going to represent a certain numerical value that are going to allow you to model that. For instance, the multiply. If you apply just like the scholar mathematical terms that you know is multiply, everything multiplies 0 is always going to be 0. 1 multiplied by something is going to be that something. So you just put there 2. I'm just going to have this to rise to value 2. Also this. So 0.5 times 2 is going to be there. So I know that I'm going to put this point there. Here you are. See? So I can predict how this curve is going to behave if I know the mathematical operations in here. Something like another example. If I move the offset, I know that the whole curve is going to move parallel. So if I do this, see? Everything is moving in parallel. Maybe it's getting darker, as you can see here, but I'm not changing something that is really important, the contrast ratio. Remember that I told you that the contrast ratio is one of the particular aspects of the characteristic curve. So here, I'm preserving the contrast ratio. There is a methodology to match the grades that is going to base on mathematical terms. So the black point and the white points, they are divisions. A lift is an inverse multiplication. The gain is exactly as the multiply, is the same operation, it's multiply, but it makes sense to have two because the lift is linked to the black point, the white point is linked to the gain, the multiply is an overall corrector, then the offset is something that is going to help you to reduce the base level without changing the contrast that have been set up with the black point and white point, because those two controls are just preserving the slope and the contrast ratio. So the offset is just going to change the appearance of black without changing the appearance of the color correct. The gamma, that is going to change the distribution of the contrast. So it's not just for mixing the midtones. That is big, misunderstanding with many compositors. It's not just to, this is for highlights, this is for black areas, and this is for the midtones. No. The gamma is just going to change the distribution of the contrast. So in here, in this first part, if we are looking into the input, the exposure, you're going to have an increase of contrast. See how the difference in horizontal is just going to result in a very high value. So from this value to this value, you have actually a change from 0 to 0.5, so it's a lot. While in here, to there, you have the same increase, but you have way more value. So you have 3 blocks to increase the same amount of 0.5 rise value. So it's a distribution of contrast. So you can change how it's behaving. Those are just modeling tools for the grading. So if you have a deep understanding of the sensitometric terms of every control that you have in the color match, from the grade to the color correct, or the toe, or the soft clip, you can have a visualization in your mind of this curve before you even look at the CG. And you can start understanding how the footage is going to behave, what you are going to need, and the most important part, when something is not working, why it's not working, and where to fix it. And all of that is because you understand the sensitometric terms of the image.
Awesome. That's our final video to show today, but I think there's been some really interesting stuff going on in the chat about monitors, color spaces, calibrating your monitors, and thank you, Hugo and Victor, for providing lots of information on that. We saw a node in that last video.
Yep.
Is that so? That's your node, isn't it, Victor, that you made?
Yeah, that is something that I created in order to explain these concepts, because sometimes it was like drawing, and I said, actually, those values are in there, so I can just create a ramp. And yeah, I'm going to do something. I'm going to put it for free, because it's like, it's nothing that it's just for learning purposes. So I'm going to put it for free, and I'm going to leave the link on the comments so you guys can download it.
That's awesome. Thank you, Victor. That'd be so useful. I think that's just that would be great. When I've been showing a junior artist in the past, and trying to explain the grade node and what each one does, just that ability to visualize exactly what it's doing, I think, is exactly what each knob is doing is really, really helpful.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah. So I hope it helps.
Thank you. It's also really good to see it kind of all of the science working in context in a shot.
Yeah. So at the end is applying the science part into the technical side. So that's what I love about our job, is science, technology, and art. So wow, we are very blessed as artists.
All right. Does anybody have any final questions? Because we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'm just gonna give you a last chance to quickly type in any questions that you would like to ask Victor.
In the meantime, I hope everybody is going to FMX. If you do, just say hello. I'm going to be there every day. So yeah, see you around there.
I'm not going this year, but a lot of Foundry team will be there as well. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to say hi to everybody who's interested in talking about Nuke, compositing, VFX, and all of that.
Yeah. I see many people is going to FMX in the comments.
Oh, that's great. It's really good fun. Actually, we met for the first time in person, I think, at FMX last year. Victor.
Last year, yeah. Last year. Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah, that I started something like this series of technology applied to compositing and things. Yeah. I have to say that I enjoy a lot, and you guys have no idea the big deal of time that I spend just doing the graphics, just in order to make clear the concepts. And that is something that everybody that is teaching is yeah, it takes a lot of time just to make that.
Well, I certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does too. I think it's a really good way of visualizing it, because it's one thing to just explain it, but another thing to actually see it working in a graph. And
yeah, because we are visual artists, so we want to see things.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, I don't think we're getting any more questions in the chat. Just a lot of love, a lot of Victor love in the chat.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And we can wrap it up now. And I hope you all have a good evening. And remember to subscribe for more webinars. Thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you.
That's brilliant.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you.